Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as Empress Deng was born in 81 CE into a family both connected and vulnerable. Her father, Deng Xiang, served the Han imperial court with distinction, but his position, like many others under Emperor Zhang, carried the risk of visibility. The Deng family name was already shadowed by its proximity to power. Her grandfather, Deng Yu, had risen with Emperor Guangwu during the foundation of the later Han and helped secure the throne. For that loyalty, the family was granted high status. But that closeness brought danger as regimes changed and rival factions grew restless. When Deng Sui was still a child, her father died, and the court's shifting allegiances left her family exposed. Yet she was not discarded. Instead, she was educated carefully, with a strong emphasis on classical learning and Confucian texts. In a time when girls of even elite houses were not often taught to read, Deng Sui was trained in law, history, and ritual. Her literacy was not ornamental. It would become the foundation of her power. She entered the imperial palace at the age of 15, selected as a consort to Emperor He. But her entrance was not marked by lavish ceremony or sudden favor. She arrived amid political tension and silent battles, and she understood the value of patience. The palace was already under the heavy influence of Empress Tu, a woman of ambition whose family dominated the inner court through a network of relatives and trusted eunuchs. Deng Sui did not challenge this directly. She observed, she waited. While other consorts vied for attention with extravagance or favors, Deng Sui remained in the background, building alliances with scholars, eunuchs, and mid-level ministers. Her intelligence was noted, but it was her caution that allowed her to survive. The court under Emperor He was marked by instability. While outwardly calm, the structure of power was fracturing. The Du family, led by Empress Dowager Du and her brothers, had positioned themselves as de facto rulers, controlling decisions behind closed doors. They maneuvered to keep the emperor isolated and dependent. Many within the court viewed this situation as temporary, expecting a new faction to rise once the emperor matured. But the longer it continued, the more it hardened into reality. Deng Sui's rise came not through confrontation, but through survival. When Empress Tu fell from favor, largely due to her abuse of influence and conflicts with Emperor He, a vacuum formed, one too dangerous for most to approach. Deng Sui, through quiet competence and the absence of enemies, was elevated. In 102 CE, she was named Empress. Her appointment did not come with celebration. It was pragmatic. She had no known ambitions, no powerful brothers waiting to ascend, no extravagant court circle demanding reward. But within the structure of Han politics, her elevation shifted the balance. She replaced an empress who had dominated and manipulated, and she did so without raising her voice. The court, weary of factional war, viewed her with caution. Ministers praised her virtue, but watched for signs of overreach. She gave them none. Instead, she maintained a low profile, refused to reward her natal family with undue power, and continued to support scholars and legalists rather than military families. She did not demand public rituals or court spectacles, but behind the walls, she studied records, reviewed edicts, and kept detailed accounts of who favored whom and why. The years following her appointment tested her discipline. Emperor. His health declined, and the palace once again began whispering of succession. Deng Sui had no children of her own, but she supported the emperor's young son by another consort, raising him within the inner palace. As the emperor's condition worsened, power began shifting towards the ministers and eunuchs who had survived Empress Du's downfall. Factions reformed, this time with new names and hidden ambitions. Deng Sui moved quietly, strengthening ties with those who had once served her grandfather and who believed in a vision of rule through principle, not blood. When Emperor He died in 106 CE, his infant son, Liu Long, ascended the throne as Emperor Shang. At just a few months old, the child could not rule. A regency was necessary. The court prepared for another violent struggle between clans, each seeking the power behind the throne. But Deng Sui had already made her preparations. In the days following the emperor's death, she secured the imperial seal, issued edicts in the new emperor's name, and summoned ministers under the pretense of mourning rituals. By the time resistance formed, she had already been declared Empress Dowager. The regency, by law and precedent, was hers. She did not announce reforms or issue proclamations. Instead, she instructed that the palace gates remain closed and that court business continue uninterrupted. The child emperor's fate remained fragile, but Deng Sui's hold on power was already firm. She had risen not through spectacle or force, but by becoming indispensable. The quiet center of an empire, too unsteady to notice, until it had already leaned into her hands. When Emperor He died in 106 CE, at the age of 27, the Han court fell into uncertainty. His only surviving son, Liu Long, was still an infant, and the political structure of the dynasty offered no clear safeguards for such a fragile succession. Deng Sui, now elevated as Empress Dowager, assumed the regency by both legal precedent and careful preparation. Yet the moment was volatile. Empress Du's former allies still held influence across various ranks of court officials, military advisors, and the eunuch bureaus. Many of them had not forgotten the quiet role Deng Sui had played in their matriarch's downfall. The death of the emperor, they believed, offered a final chance to reclaim influence by sidelining her. What they underestimated was how deliberately Deng Sui had arranged her position long before the crisis. Within days of Emperor He's passing, she secured control over the imperial seal, issued decrees in the new emperor's name, and summoned key officials to affirm the succession. She did not present herself as sovereign, nor did she allow her family to flood the palace with appointments or privileges. She presented herself as guardian of a fragile child emperor, upholding dynastic stability during a time of mourning. This was not a ceremonial title. It was a strategic frame. By refusing to appear ambitious, she removed the justification her enemies needed to act against her. But behind the veil of formality, she began reshaping the court. Officials known for private alliances with the Du clan were gradually reassigned or investigated under minor pretexts. None were executed immediately, but the message was clear. Deng Sui's authority was not symbolic. It was administrative, and it was growing. At the heart of the palace machinery, the eunuch establishment had become one of the most dangerous power centers. Over the years, they had transitioned from servants to gatekeepers, controlling access to the emperor and manipulating court appointments through bribes and private deals. Deng Sui understood that any attempt to uproot this system suddenly would invite retaliation or even assassination. Instead, she began to narrow their influence. Key eunuchs were quietly removed from sensitive posts, while others were replaced with those who had shown loyalty to her family during the earlier power struggles. She also imposed new record-keeping systems on palace expenditures and personnel. This seemingly bureaucratic act forced eunuchs to account for their decisions in writing, reducing the space for informal favoritism. These moves were not loud, but they signaled a shift. Power was no longer dispersed by personal favor. It was being centralized through process, with Deng Sui at the center. To the wider court, Deng Sui's regency appeared stable and restrained. She did not demand public reverence. She did not expand the privileges of the Empress Dowager. She lowered palace expenses and curtailed ceremonial excesses, citing the need for humility after the emperor's death. But these policies also served another purpose. They restricted the channels through which rival factions could redistribute wealth and favors. Court expenditures had long been a tool for political patronage, and by controlling the flow of resources, Deng Sui tightened her grip on influence without appearing aggressive. Ministers who had once served under her grandfather, Deng Yu, began returning to court with renewed purpose. These men were not revolutionaries. They were administrators, scholars, and legalists who shared her belief in principled governance. Under her regency, their proposals were no longer buried. Some were enacted immediately. While the infant Emperor Shang was too young to rule, his symbolic presence remained essential. Deng Sui ensured he was seen in court rituals, carried through formal processions, and named in all state documents. But it was clear to everyone that decisions were coming from her. Her regency did not resemble the violent takeovers of previous decades, where rival families had seized control through threats or mass purges. Her method was different. She presented continuity, not disruption. Yet at every layer of government, she replaced uncertain allies with reliable ones, tightened surveillance on military posts near the capital, and slowly pushed the influence of the Du family out of court. It was not the throne she craved. It was what the throne kept from unraveling. During the early years of her regency, the latter Han Empire was strained by a series of natural disasters that exposed the fragility of its institutions. Widespread drought struck northern provinces, followed by locust infestations that destroyed crops across the Yellow River Basin. Floods soon followed in the south, cutting off supply lines and isolating regions already weakened by food shortages. In the face of compounding famine, Deng Sui took measures that departed sharply from imperial tradition. Rather than rely solely on local magistrates or the usual slow-moving channels of tribute and tax relief, she ordered the opening of palace granaries and authorized direct shipments of grain to the most affected areas. These stores had once been reserved for imperial banquets and elite ritual use. Now, under her instruction, they became lifelines for starving households across multiple prefectures. She also suspended or delayed the collection of taxes in stricken regions, knowing that the financial cost to the treasury would raise objections. But she did not waver. In a court where generosity could be seen as weakness, Deng Sui treated stability as a moral responsibility. As the disasters continued, reports of unrest began to spread. In the more remote Western territories, food riots turned into attacks on tax offices. In some areas, rebel groups emerged, invoking past dynastic grievances to rally desperate followers. Deng Sui responded with discipline. She did not rush to send out large armies, fearing the long-term consequences of turning short-term rebellion into prolonged warfare. Instead, she expanded the authority of provincial governors she trusted, granting them temporary powers to reduce punishments and issue emergency provisions. Where violence escalated, she approved swift containment through targeted military detachments, ensuring that suppression did not become spectacle. Her strategy reflected a balance between deterrence and de-escalation. It was not born of idealism. It was shaped by her understanding of the state's limits and the political cost of overreaction. Within the palace, her choices began to shift the atmosphere. Extravagant court ceremonies were scaled back. Construction projects, seen as wasteful or ceremonial, were postponed indefinitely. Even within the inner chambers of the Empress Dowager, expenses were cut. Palace staff were reduced. Officials tasked with protocol found themselves reassigned to administrative posts where real management was needed. These moves were not done for public acclaim. They were part of a broader message that the imperial household would not remain untouched by the hardship gripping the country. By modeling restraint from the center of power, Deng Sui created a new expectation for court behavior. Ministers who had once built influence through gift exchanges and ritual participation now had to show evidence of policy competence. The shift was subtle but decisive. She did not change the shape of government through revolution. She realigned its incentives. Despite the outward calm, the tensions inside the court deepened. Some senior officials began to fear the precedent her regency was setting. The longer she ruled without scandal, and the more the empire survived under her leadership, the harder it became to dismiss her as a temporary placeholder. Her decisions did not draw attention to themselves, but they left a trail of administrative reforms that could not be undone easily. Reports reached her of court whisperings, that her rule was soft, even delicate, that she governed like silk. But the ministers who said so also knew that those who obstructed her decisions often found their careers quietly ended. Some were transferred to far provinces without explanation. Others were investigated for minor infractions and removed under technical charges. There were no purges, no mass exiles. But within a year of the worst famine, many of her fiercest critics no longer held court positions. Her strength was not in intimidation, but in control. She kept detailed records of policy failures, tracked the delivery of relief supplies personally, and ensured that military spending did not rise under the cover of civil unrest. While the empire struggled through disease outbreaks and unstable weather patterns, the central administration became more efficient. The sense of quiet order returned slowly, and when it did, it was credited not to a dramatic recovery, but to the lack of collapse. Deng Sui did not claim credit. She issued no personal edicts of self-praise and allowed no songs to be composed in her honor. Her reward was continuity, and the knowledge that the dynasty had survived another crisis without needing spectacle or force. With famine relief underway and basic order restored, Deng Sui turned her attention to the core machinery of the empire. Years of unchecked favoritism, hidden bribes, and ceremonial privilege had left the Han bureaucracy bloated and uneven. Underneath the surface of court rituals and official obedience. Regional governors withheld revenue, local magistrates padded reports, and military commanders leveraged imperial unrest to expand their influence unchecked. Deng Sui began with a financial audit, not of palace expenses, but of the provincial tribute system. She called for a re-examination of tax reports from prefectures across the empire, cross-checking records of grain, labor, and coinage with new returns collected under direct supervision. In many cases, she found discrepancies buried under decades of forged signatures and missing seals. Some regions had reported the same population figures for years, hiding migration and tax evasion. Others had withheld grain shipments by exploiting exemptions meant for disaster relief. Rather than expose these errors through public accusation, Deng Sui implemented a policy of administrative correction. Officials who cooperated were retained under stricter oversight. Those who resisted were dismissed. The message was not of punishment, but of reset. Parallel to these reforms, she targeted the gift economy that had sustained the court's informal power structure. High-ranking officials had long used ceremonial gifts, jewels, textiles, horses, as a veiled form of political currency. Deng Sui ordered that all gifts to the palace, no matter their purpose, be recorded publicly. Ministers now had to list the contents, value, and recipient of any offering made in the name of loyalty or custom. While the edict did not outlaw gift-giving, it removed its secrecy. In a culture where appearances mattered more than laws, this transparency chilled the practice almost immediately. Fewer gifts meant fewer obligations. Fewer obligations meant a freer hand for the regent. But this freedom also narrowed the court's margins for negotiation. Some senior families, particularly those with military connections, viewed the change as a threat to their traditional standing. Deng Sui responded not with confrontation, but with appointments. She promoted scholars trained in the Confucian academies, men who had passed their civil service examinations with distinction but lacked noble titles or battlefield records. These appointments were often to key advisory positions, roles that did not carry troops, but influenced taxation, education, and legal judgment. Her choices reflected a philosophy rooted in bureaucratic rationalism. The scholar official, guided by text and ritual, was to be the new standard of service. Yet this shift had political consequences. Generals, especially those stationed in the empire's western territories, saw themselves being sidelined. Their victories no longer translated into court rank. Their requests for increased stipends were subjected to scholarly review. As their influence narrowed, they began looking for advocates within the inner court. One of those advocates was Liang Ji. Though still rising at this stage, Liang Ji had family connections that placed him close to power, and a temperament that diverged from Deng Sui's restraint. Where she governed through administrative correction, he moved through favors, threats, and private alliances. He was not yet powerful enough to oppose her directly, but he understood the frustrations building beneath her reforms. Military families began speaking in private of imbalance, that the empire's peace came at the cost of neglecting its borders. Some ministers whispered that promoting scribes over soldiers would invite rebellion from the frontier. Liang Ji listened carefully. His public loyalty to the Empress Dowager remained intact, but his network of influence began to grow outward, targeting officials whose careers had been stalled under the new meritocratic system. Deng Sui, meanwhile, continued her policy changes without pause. She expanded the imperial libraries, increased the number of examination posts for scholars, and further restricted palace expenditures. She did not seek public approval for these reforms. Her focus remained on the ledger, on numbers, records, and outcomes. But the balance she had created was now delicate. Beneath the administrative order, new rivalries had begun to take shape, not through violence, but through calculation. The quiet rise of Liang Ji would not yet challenge her openly, but his path forward would be shaped by the very rules she had rewritten. In the final months of 106 CE, the infant emperor Liu Long, posthumously known as Emperor Shang, grew weaker with each passing week. His rule, always symbolic, never reached a point of political activity. He was too young to speak, too ill to survive, and the weight of the Han Dynasty rested entirely on the regency of Deng Sui. She made no public display of emotion during the boy's decline. Her care for him was documented only in brief records of palace physicians and ritual observances, but her role remained fixed, not as a mother, but as steward of a throne that had no voice to defend itself. When the child died within the year, the court fell into immediate uncertainty. With no designated successor and no surviving sons of Emperor He, the question of inheritance returned not to bloodline, but to choice. Deng Sui moved swiftly. She selected another adopted heir, Liu Hu, a young boy from a distant imperial branch, and installed him as Emperor An. The decision was not without precedent. In times of crisis, the Han court had often reached sideways across the imperial clan for successors. But this selection came from Deng Sui alone. There was no recorded consultation of court elders or public nomination process. Her authority had become procedural, and the bureaucracy, shaped by her reforms, moved with her. The new emperor was just 12 years old enough to be present in ceremony, young enough to be guided. His biological ties to the main line were distant. To many in the inner court, it became clear that the dynasty was now surviving by artificial extension. Deng Sui had no sons of her own, no legacy of blood to preserve, no personal interest in a future beyond the order she imposed. Her attachment was not to individuals, but to structure. And that structure, under pressure from decades of instability and rising internal divisions, now held together because she refused to let it collapse. As regent once more, Deng Sui resumed her control over imperial edicts, appointments, and state decisions. But the court was no longer unified. Some ministers resented the installation of an heir who lacked strong clan backing. Others viewed Deng Sui's growing control as a quiet rejection of dynastic continuity. For a dynasty founded on lineage, ruled by ancestral precedent, her refusal to pass power along familial lines disturbed the balance between public ritual and private power. She did not respond to criticism directly. Instead, she expanded the use of Confucian ceremony around the new emperor, ensuring that his appearance at seasonal sacrifices and state rituals reaffirmed legitimacy. Behind those ceremonies, however, Deng Sui retained all practical authority. The emperor's signature appeared on documents, but the decisions were hers. She had replaced the image of paternal succession with a model of managed stewardship. Emotionally, her position grew more isolated. She had buried an emperor, raised a child to the throne who died under her regency, and now guided another boy not born of her household. Within the palace, She reduced court activity and limited public celebrations. Her own family received no promotions or titles beyond what had been granted in previous years. She lived among rows of bureaucrats, eunuchs, and scribes, surrounded by a system she kept alive without personal reward. Her power came without intimacy. It was sustained by discipline and the absence of scandal, but it carried no warmth. Even those closest to her operated within strict protocols. In official records, there are no indications of favoritism, indulgence, or personal alliances. There is only documentation of her decisions and the quiet continuity they enforced. For those observing from the edges of court life, the Empress Dowager had become more than a regent. She was the custodian of a dynasty held together by bureaucracy rather than blood. And as Emperor On took his place in formal proceedings, the reality beneath the surface remained unchanged. The empire moved as she directed it. Her authority was absolute, but built on a paradox: a woman with no heirs defending a throne that could not hold itself. The cost of that clarity was distance. She stood alone, the silent force behind two emperors, neither of whom had called her mother. In the third year of Emperor An's reign, the court experienced a series of quiet but decisive shifts. 3 senior figures, each once seen as potential centers of opposition to Deng Sui's regency, died within a span of months. Official records list their causes as illness, age, or exhaustion from long service, and no investigation followed any of their deaths. Yet in the silence surrounding these departures, the architecture of power began to tilt. The first was a former general who had grown increasingly vocal about the imbalance of authority between military command and court bureaucracy. He had no record of insubordination, but his private correspondence suggested frustration with Deng Sui's scholar-focused appointments and the reduced role of provincial garrisons. His death, from what was described as a sudden internal ailment, removed one of the few voices capable of organizing resistance outside the capital. The second was a mid-ranking minister whose family ties linked him to the long-fallen Du clan. He had survived the earlier purges by keeping his distance from factional disputes. But as the regency lengthened, he began reconnecting with disaffected households that had lost influence under Deng Sui. His decline was gradual, marked by headaches and fever, but no diagnosis was ever confirmed. By the time he was declared unfit to serve, his replacement had already been selected. The third death struck closer to the palace. A eunuch official with access to imperial communications died unexpectedly after several days of acute stomach pain. Though he had shown no signs of political ambition, his proximity to court transmissions made him a potential risk. He had been appointed during the reign of Emperor He and had once acted as an intermediary between palace factions. As newer figures rose under Deng Sui's administration, his role narrowed. Still, he retained knowledge of old allegiances, and several dismissed officials were known to have visited his quarters in recent months. His passing was noted in the court bulletin, but without tribute or elaboration. His archives were sealed and transferred to palace record keepers under direct supervision. Deng Sui never commented on any of these deaths, and there is no evidence of formal inquiry. But in the space they left behind, her administrative control deepened. No decree named these men as enemies. Their names were not erased, their families not punished. Their removal came through the absence of alarm. Each departure, though different in nature and context, resulted in the same outcome: the slow elimination of influence that had once operated beyond the reach of the Empress Dowager. Her method was not retaliation, it was calibration. In an empire still recovering from famine, rebellion, and internal mistrust, Deng Sui viewed disorder not as an eruption, but as a slow leak. Left unchecked, even marginal figures could become vessels for discontent. Her solution was to reduce exposure, not through show trials or exile, but through administrative finality. She rarely confronted problems directly. Instead, she worked through vacancy, reappointment, and silence. In the months that followed, appointments once delayed were finalized. Several scholar officials from lower-ranking provinces were brought to the capital and placed in advisory roles once reserved for older court families. Deng Sui's pattern remained consistent. She selected men with no private armies, no clan ambitions, and no ties to disgraced lineages. In doing so, she reduced the likelihood of collusion across ministries. Each appointment diluted the remaining influence of noble houses that had dominated the court in previous generations. The balance of power no longer depended on inheritance or proximity to military command. It now flowed through loyalty measured by compliance, not lineage. Throughout this period, her public image remained unchanged. She continued to approve flood control projects, maintained austerity measures inside the palace, and funded educational initiatives in the interior provinces. Nothing in her public edicts reflected the changes unfolding in the court's private structure. The outward appearance was one of managed calm, but inside the imperial administration, the message was clear. Resistance did not have to be punished. It only had to disappear. By the middle years of her regency, Deng Sui had begun redirecting the very foundation of imperial legitimacy. Rather than rely on bloodlines, court alliances, or military achievements, she placed her faith in the written word. Education, which had long been the domain of elite families and Confucian ritual specialists, became a tool for state reorganization. She allocated palace funds for the copying of classical texts and ordered the expansion of libraries in major administrative centers. In Luoyang, the imperial capital, she authorized the construction of additional reading halls and staffed them with scholars drawn not from noble clans, but from the ranks of provincially tested men. These scholars were often poor, without lineage or powerful patrons, but had mastered the Confucian canon through state examinations. Under Deng Sui, their ranks grew larger and more influential, serving as magistrates, legal consultants, and policy advisors. The official curriculum shifted in emphasis from ancestral worship and poetic recitation to ethics, administration, and the practical application of law. In doing so, Deng Sui reshaped the entry point to power. Authority could now be earned through intellectual merit, not inherited through status. This shift brought immediate results. Provincial reports became more detailed and standardized. Legal interpretations across counties became more uniform. Corruption complaints were processed faster, and inconsistencies in tax records were flagged by scholars trained to detect fraud through close reading of ancient precedents. The empire's internal paperwork began to reflect a level of discipline that had not been seen in decades. But the transformation was not without consequence. Many of the long-standing aristocratic families viewed these changes as an erosion of traditional hierarchy. For centuries, certain offices had passed quietly from father to son, sustained by ritual expectations and family reputation. Now, their heirs were forced to sit for examinations alongside men of no social standing. Some passed, many failed. And each failure became a quiet humiliation that weakened their hold on regional authority. Within the palace, the scholar officials gained access to new circles of influence. Deng Sui relied on their memoranda to guide judicial decisions, to draft tax codes, and to formalize disciplinary measures against local governors. This rising class owed their positions to her structure, not to independent power. They formed no military units, held no land grants, and made no bids for legacy. Their allegiance was to the bureaucracy, and in that allegiance, Deng Sui found a buffer against older forms of challenge. But over time, even her allies began to question the limits of this intellectual consolidation, with so much of the empire's function now tied to written records. Knowledge became a form of gatekeeping. Decisions that had once been made through consultation or deliberation were now justified through citation. Authority rested not in shared power, but in documented precedents. For the Empress Dowager, this structure offered security. By replacing rival factions with compliant administrators, she narrowed the range of potential opposition. But it also created a court increasingly isolated from the broader realities of the empire. The scholars understood texts, but few had governed border regions or managed armies. Their interpretations of law and history often ignored the pressures faced by local magistrates or generals. As their influence expanded, so did resentment. Reports began to arrive from outlying provinces where military officers questioned edicts written by scholars who had never left the capital. The once sidelined generals, though quiet under her direct control, started exchanging correspondence with officials who felt their voices had been displaced by bureaucratic exactness. Deng Sui was aware of these tensions, but her commitment to institutional rule did not waver. She continued to fund academic posts, expanded the storage of imperial archives, and issued new policies that made Confucian education mandatory for children of court officials. The empire she governed was no longer an inheritance passed through family lines. It was a network of knowledge, submission to text, and obedience to the rules she had written into place. Whether this network served the people or served her control was a question left unanswered. Her vision of empire was orderly, rational, and deeply structured. But the more precisely she built it, the more distant it became from those not permitted to read its design. By the year 121 CE, Emperor An had reached adulthood. The legal justification for Deng Sui's regency no longer held. Her authority, once rooted in the guardianship of a child emperor, now rested on precedent and presence. Yet the machinery of government still responded to her commands. Ministers continued to bring their memoranda to her residence. Edicts were reviewed and issued under her seal before reaching the emperor's hand. Even palace eunuchs, those who had once served as conduits to the emperor, remained aligned with her inner circle. The structures she had built, from education to tax regulation, moved with quiet efficiency, shaped around her priorities and timelines. In appearance, she had stepped back. In practice, the empire still turned with her breath. But within the court, signs of change had already begun. A new circle was forming, around Emperor An, composed of young officials, ambitious eunuchs, and members of his birth family who had waited years for influence. They understood that no rule lasts without contest, and Deng Sui's restraint was no longer viewed as virtue. It was seen as obstruction. The relationship between Deng Sui and Emperor An grew strained. Though she had raised him within the palace and preserved his succession against competing factions, their bond never reached the level of trust that marked earlier reigns. His vision of rule, shaped by those around him, favored symbolic gestures of renewal and independence. He began to voice discomfort with the legacy of scholar dominance and the limits placed on military expansion. Where Deng Sui had measured policy in terms of bureaucratic integrity, Emperor An sought gestures of strength, visible rulership, assertive appointments, and the revival of clan influence. His advisors encouraged these leanings, quietly warning that prolonged submission to a dowager, even one respected, would signal weakness. The divide was generational, but it was also strategic. For Deng Sui, continuity depended on the careful distribution of control. For Emperor An, it required reclaiming space that had never been his to define. Sensing the shift, Deng Sui began preparing for withdrawal, not through public announcement, but by realigning key offices. She promoted officials with moderate views, those capable of serving both emperor and court without falling into personal allegiance. She issued a final round of appointments to provincial posts and confirmed long-delayed nominations to the Imperial Academy. These moves, though procedural on the surface, locked into place her final imprint on the administrative landscape. She also began transferring archives and policy drafts to central bureaus, reducing the number of documents filtered directly through her residence. These were signs of departure, made visible only to those who understood the court's rhythms. But even as she stepped back from daily management, she resisted attempts to erase the structures she had built. Several of Emperor An's early proposals, especially those aimed at re-expanding noble family privileges and loosening restrictions on military gifts, met quiet obstacles. Records were returned with revisions. Budgetary justifications were denied. No public confrontation occurred, but the friction grew. Within the inner palace, Deng Sui maintained a schedule that kept her physically distant from the emperor's court, but politically engaged. She held private audiences with select ministers and continued to receive reports from regional governors who still saw her as the stabilizing force of the dynasty. Her presence became spectral, never obstructing, never interfering, but always known. The palace had become a space of dual power, though only one figure now wore the crown. Those who supported Deng Sui began to notice signs of coordinated distancing. Historians in the court's record bureau were quietly encouraged to revise entries from the previous 2 decades. Her role in economic recovery, disaster relief, and educational reform began to appear in abbreviated form. In state rituals, her titles were used less frequently. These changes were not overt purges, but they pointed to a broader strategy: to reframe the past in order to clear space for the present. Deng Sui did not resist with counter-edicts or accusations. She responded with silence and precision. In her final months of active influence, she reviewed her own records, removed unnecessary staff, and placed her household under strict budgetary limits. She made no attempt to fortify her name against forgetting. She understood the fate of widowed empresses who lingered too long. The empire had been rebuilt with hands that left no monuments, and she knew that in time, those hands would be swept from view. But she also knew that systems, once constructed with enough discipline, do not vanish with their creator. They recede, but they endure, quietly, invisibly, for a little while longer. Empress Dowager Deng Sui died in April of 121 CE, her passing marked by an elaborate state funeral that followed the full rites of a regent empress. Her coffin was escorted through Luoyang under heavy ceremonial guard, and the imperial court entered the required mourning period. Memorial tablets were carved. Her name was spoken in the ancestral hall. But even as incense burned in her honor, the political groundwork for her erasure was already underway. Emperor An, newly untethered from her presence, moved swiftly to dismantle the systems she had left behind. Within weeks, a number of her loyal officials were removed from office. Some were exiled to distant provinces under the pretext of administrative reshuffling. Others simply disappeared from the public record. The inner circle of scholar administrators who had formed the spine of her regime found themselves replaced by younger men favored by the emperor's personal advisors. The scholar's empire she had spent over a decade constructing began to fragment. Her educational policies, which had once tied rank to examination performance, were quietly revised. Clan privilege resumed its place in determining court appointments. Ritual texts, previously standardized under her supervision, were amended to reflect older traditions that emphasized ancestral lineages and noble descent. The empire's archive centers, built during her regency and stocked with transcribed classics, lost state funding. Several regional libraries were closed. In one known incident, a storehouse of copied scrolls in the southern provinces was burned during a riot. The cause left uninvestigated. The deeper structure she had shaped of administrative oversight, fiscal restraint, and knowledge-based promotion was no longer protected. The emperor's court did not destroy it publicly. They let it dissolve by neglect. The new ruling circle favored visibility over continuity. Power had returned to familiar hands, and those hands no longer belonged to scribes. Still, her name carried weight. Despite efforts to distance the court from her rule, Deng Sui's presence lingered in the routines of the bureaucracy. Some governors continued to apply her budgetary guidelines even without formal mandate. Civil servants, trained under her system, kept her methods alive in the margins of daily governance. But these traces were kept quiet. In court records, her contributions were reduced to ceremonial acts. In official histories compiled during Emperor An's reign, her role was acknowledged briefly, then passed over. Her political decisions were framed as transitional, her reforms as temporary responses to crisis. No crimes were attributed to her, but neither were her intentions preserved. She was remembered only as caretaker, never as architect. Among scholars and court observers, stories circulated that she had left behind sealed documents. These were said to contain policy recommendations, revisions to imperial law, and long-term plans for rebuilding civil infrastructure. Plans never enacted during her life. Some believed she had hidden them within the archives of the imperial secretariat. Others claimed that trusted eunuchs had taken them to distant provinces, awaiting a time when another ruler would value them. None were ever found, or at least none were ever declared. But the rumor itself became a symbol. It suggested that her governance had not been a reaction to circumstance, but a deliberate intervention in the course of the Han Dynasty. A map for what the empire could become, buried under what it was. Despite the quiet dismantling of her legacy, her funeral remained a public demonstration of imperial gratitude. The procession passed through multiple administrative districts, with banners, musicians, and guards in full ceremonial form. Her remains were placed in the imperial tombs, her title preserved in stone. But in court, her name was no longer spoken in deliberations. Edicts no longer cited her precedents. Her image was absent from the murals commissioned under the emperor's new building campaigns. She had shaped the dynasty's stability for over 15 years, yet the court she had ruled sought no memory of her governance. Her end was not marked by scandal or disgrace. It was marked by deliberate absence, a removal so clean it suggested preparation. And yet, in the footnotes of records, in the annotations of laws still in use, traces of her decisions remained. Her name faded. Her influence did not. In the centuries following Deng Sui's death, the records of her reign remained sparse and scattered, shaped largely by the dynasty that had sought to forget her. Official histories mentioned her only briefly, often relegating her to ceremonial titles and transitional duties. Yet within the structure of the empire she left behind, her fingerprints endured. The later Han did not collapse during her regency. It endured longer than many expected, given the scale of unrest, natural disaster, and internal disintegration she inherited. Her rule came during a moment when imperial succession was unstable, military influence was unchecked, and regional governance had lost coherence. Without an army, without sons, and without open declarations of power, she held the empire together. Her approach was not marked by grandeur. It was measured, administrative, and quiet. Through fiscal discipline, education reform, and the expansion of civil bureaucracy, she recentered the empire around the mechanisms of policy, rather than the force of personality. Her power did not come from spectacle, it came from continuity. The period following her death made clear the vacuum she had filled. Emperor An's reign, no longer restrained by her oversight, drifted toward internal factionalism. Eunuchs rose in prominence. Noble families resumed their battles for inheritance and access. The reforms Deng Sui had enacted, designed to limit corruption and standardize administrative appointments, were weakened by neglect and reversed by design. Tax revenue faltered, border conflicts intensified, and the educational system, once restructured around meritocratic ideals, returned to familiar hierarchies. But even as her name was scrubbed from regular mention, the practical memory of her governance lingered. Civil servants continued using her forms. Regional officials quietly maintained elements of her disaster response protocols. Her influence was embedded not in the stories told about her, but in the habits of governance she had normalized. In time, later dynasties would look back at her model of silent regency and see not erasure, but example. When the Eastern Han finally collapsed in 200 TCE, nearly a century after her birth, China entered a period of warlordism and fragmentation. The imperial center shattered, and regional powers split the country into competing states. Yet the administrative methods developed under her regency, centralized bureaucracy, state-sponsored education, standardization of legal process, did not vanish. They were adopted, adapted, and revived across successive regimes. From the short-lived Wei dynasty to the far-reaching structure of the Tang centuries later, echoes of Deng Sui's approach remained. Her reign became a reference point, not in official titles, but in practice. Historians of later periods began to re-evaluate the women of the Han court, not just as consorts or regents, but as figures of actual policy significance. In that re-evaluation, Deng Sui stood apart. Unlike others, she had not governed in her family's name or to preserve her children's inheritance. She had governed without personal legacy. Her story also altered the pattern through which female power was understood. She did not rule through seduction, religious authority, or open manipulation. She ruled through restraint. She rejected the use of military allegiance, denied her family the chance to monopolize appointments, and manage succession without claiming legitimacy beyond necessity. In doing so, she made herself difficult to categorize. Traditional narratives of imperial China left little space for women who neither failed nor fell dramatically. Deng Sui's disappearance from ceremonial memory was, in part, the result of that ambiguity. Her rule challenged the assumption that authority required visibility. She proved that influence could operate through silence, that governance could function without proclamation, and that a dynasty could be sustained not by command, but by endurance. The deeper irony of her reign lies in the timing. She held the Han steady during its moment of most dangerous drift. But once the dynasty resumed the familiar shape of patriarchal rule, it began unraveling from within. The very structures she preserved, court ritual, civil appointments, revenue administration, were repurposed by those who saw them as tools for consolidation, not balance. The strength she demonstrated was temporary because it was not inherited. No figure followed her model. No institution protected it. And yet, generations later, historians writing under the Sui and Tang dynasties revisited the crisis years of the Eastern Han and found in her administration a rare moment of order, competence, and clarity. There were no temples built in her honor. Her name was not spoken in daily rites. She left behind no heirs to protect her memory and no monuments to display her image. Yet the dynasty she held together for 15 years did not collapse under her watch. She proved that a ruler does not need to possess lineage to protect it. She ruled in the spaces between official power and practical necessity. In that space, she imposed stability on a dynasty that could no longer hold itself still. History remembered her late and reluctantly, but it remembered her. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?